Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, everyone. Such a good crowd for August. Yasher Koach to everybody for beating the heat and being here to make a minyan and support everybody who's coming here to be together. Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. God spoke the world into being. Bernie led us this morning in chanting these words in Psukei de Zimra, our warm-up for the davening. And God creates with words. God, yes, but also human beings have the ability to create worlds with our words. Judaism attests to the sacred power of words. Our Parsha opens, and I'm going to turn us way back to the beginning because we listened to a lot of words of Torah today. It's a double portion, many things to discover, but we're going to go back to the beginning. V'daber Moshe el Rashi Hamatot, and Moses spoke to the head of the tribes, saying, Zeh hadabar asher tziva Adonai. This is what Adonai has commanded. And we continue. If a person makes a vow to Adonai or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his promise. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. The writer Erica Brown, in her commentary on the book of Numbers, comments on these verses, words uttered are worlds created. When I read these words, and many of you might have had the same thought upon hearing the beginning of this Parsha, I could not help but think about how in 12 weeks we will be standing here praying Kol Nidre together, bathing in that haunting melody that conveys something that is impossible to explain in words. I want to put the opening of our Parsha in conversation with Kol Nidre today as we begin our preparations for the High Holy Days. Kol Nidre, one of our most mysterious and beloved liturgical moments. Kol Nidre, v'esareh, u'shvu'eh, v'chadarmeh, u'knameh, v'chi nuyeh. All vows, renunciations, bans, oaths, formulas of obligation, pledges, and promises that we vow or promise to ourselves and to God from this Yom Kippur until next, we hereby retract. May they be undone, repealed, canceled, voided, annulled, and regarded as neither valid nor binding. What do we mean when we say this prayer? Is it even a prayer? It sounds a bit more like an Aramaic legal text. If words create worlds, what does it mean to annul those words? In our earliest Siddur, the first one that we know about, it's called Seder Rav Amram, and it was written in the 9th century in Babylonia. We find the text of Kol Nidre with a note from Rav Amram. He says, there are some who say Kol Nidre, but this is a foolish practice and it is forbidden to do it. So he has the words there and then he says, but really, you shouldn't. Rav Amram's disdain for Kol Nidre was shared by Jewish leaders over the years, and maybe some of us might think for a good reason, because Kol Nidre raises some questions. First, the Talmud does describe a method for being released from vows, but it doesn't look anything like Kol Nidre. The verbs are in past tense, but the text says that the vows being nullified are from the future. Why did Rav Amram and the Geonim, his contemporary rabbinical authorities, dislike it so much? And why are we so attached to it? In the end, the rabbis lost and the will of the people won out. Kol Nidre is here to stay. It was once popularly believed that Kol Nidre dated back to 15th century Spain, during the days of the Inquisition, when Jews were forced to convert to Christianity on pain of death. In fact, Kol Nidre may be among our most ancient liturgy. Scholars found evidence of its formula in Babylonian incantation bowls from 300 to 700 CE that have been excavated in present-day Iraq. These magic bowls, and I read that over 2,000 have been found, contain inscriptions in Aramaic, in a spiral, beginning from the rim and moving towards the center. These bowls were buried face down in thresholds, courtyards, and cemeteries to capture demons. Scholars believe that Kol Nidre had its start not in 15th century Spain, and not with the rabbis of the Talmud, like so many of our laws and practices and liturgy, but rather in the world of the folk rituals of antiquity. In thinking about Kol Nidre, Rabbi Eliezer Diamond wonders how to balance out the importance of this liturgical moment and the confusing and questionable nature of its content. But Rabbi Diamond quotes Hillel, who said, if the Jewish people are not prophets, then they're at least the children of prophets. The Jewish people intuitively understood that Kol Nidre is somehow exactly what we need in order to become that luminescent tabula rasa, to wipe the slate clean and be prepared for the coming year. But back to our text from Numbers. In our Wednesday morning Parsha class, Professor Ellen Davis, who we had the pleasure to learn from this week, suggested that when we study a text that seems foreign or difficult, we ask the question, what is at stake? If a person makes a vow to Adonai or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his promise. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. In the biblical mind, what is at stake in these verses? To understand, we might look at a few biblical examples of vows made. The first that came to my mind was Hannah in the book of Samuel, who in her wretchedness prayed to Adonai, weeping, and she made this vow, Adonai Tzivaot, if you will look upon my suffering, and you will remember me and not forget me, and you grant me a male child, I will dedicate him to Adonai for all the days of his life. And indeed, we know the story from being present on the High Holy Days and hearing it chanted. We know that that's indeed what Hannah did. She dedicated her child to the service in Samuel's temple, and she brought her baby and left him at the doorstep. The second example is from the book of Judges, and it's actually much darker. It's the story of Yiftach. On behalf of Israel, Yiftach challenged the Ammonites and swore an oath to God. If we win, when I return to my house, whatever comes out from the door of my house to meet me when I return from the Ammonites shall be Adonai's, and I will offer it up as a burnt offering. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this truly horrific story, the victorious Yiftach is met on his return by his only child, who runs out to meet him. He tears his clothes and cries and says, alas, my daughter, but he's bound by his vow. I have opened my mouth to Adonai and I cannot take my vow. Apparently, he read this week's Parsha very closely, maybe too closely. A terrifying example, of course, of what it means to make a vow in the biblical mind. The third example is Jacob, who in Genesis chapter 28 makes a vow saying, if God remains with me, protecting me on my journey, giving me bread to eat, clothes to wear, and I return safely to my father's house, Adonai shall be my God. Somehow, to our ears, it doesn't sound quite as dramatic as the example from Judges, but think about it. What's at stake? Jacob's vow might actually be the most impactful. Even though Hannah and Yiftach were each personally deeply, deeply impacted by the repercussions of their vows, Jacob's vow set the course for an entire people, for our people. What's at stake? We continue to live out Jacob's vow today. Words create realities. For this reason, the rabbis taught that it's often better not to vow. So in the Talmud, they built upon a verse from Kohelet. Kohelet said, it's better not to vow than to vow and not fulfill. And Rabbi Yehuda said, it's better not to vow than to vow and not fulfill, quoting the verse. But he added on to it and he said, but it's better than both of these to bring your lamb to the temple courtyard and slaughter it. In other words, don't promise that you will make a sacrifice. Just make the sacrifice. Don't promise to do more or to do better. Just give, just do. Our tradition talks about vows and promises because we as humans are inclined to promise things. And maybe this is not such a bad quality. We're enthusiastic and hopeful, aspirational. But sometimes situations change and the vows we made don't make sense anymore. How can we stay consistent and yet not become rigid? Rabbi Josh Fagelson discussed this in his discussion of the Parsha, in which he brought in Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Liener of Ishbitz, the Ishbitzer Rebbe from the 19th century, who built on a teaching from Rashi related to the first line of the verses that we're looking at today. Zeh hadavar asher tziva Adonai. This is the thing. And some of you might have noticed in Gabby's beautiful chanting of the Haftarah, the formula that we hear very often in later prophets. When they introduce their prophecy, God's prophecy, they say, Ko amar Hashem, Ko amar Adonai. But Moses doesn't start that way. Moses starts with Zeh hadavar. He's more specific. And the Ishbitzer says, he interprets it to say that this thing, Zeh hadavar, belongs to this generation. Moses understood that the prophecy was given for this specific time, and that after the time, God might inspire a different prophecy. Moses, after all, was a man of great humility and understood that these words are limited. All words are limited. A vow, if held without attention to our lived experience, rather than bringing us closer to service of God, can drive us further away from it if we're not attentive. Vows may be situational, then, and not absolute. There's a necessary tension between expectations that we will follow through with our word and the understanding that situations change. I think about Biden pivoting and giving up the presidential nomination in order to make room for Kamala Harris to step forward. We must strive not to make promises that we can't keep. How many times have we said yes to something we cannot do because it feels better to say yes in the moment? And we know we're going to make promises. To vow is human. But perhaps it's actually also divine. Erica Brown, in her commentary on the book of Numbers, brought in a beautiful midrash in which God takes an oath to destroy the children of Israel because of the incident with the golden calf. And then there's this really interesting dialogue in the midrash, in the story of in the midrash, between Moses and God, in which Moses told God he could not override the oath. Isn't God bound by God's own oath? God says, I cannot retract an oath which has come out of my mouth. Then Moses actually appeals to God's own laws, the laws that we were given in the Torah and the Talmud. He says, God, didn't you, God, give me the power of the annulment of oaths, which we find in the Talmud, by saying, and then he quotes our verse, when a man vows a vow to Adonai or swears an oath, he cannot break his word. Yet the Talmud has a formula in which we can absolve his vows if you consult a rabbi. So Moses wraps himself in a cloak in the manner of a rabbinic sage. And God stands before Moses for an annulment of the divine vow. God says God's own Kol Nidre. God finds a way back, in Erica Brown's words, a way out of language. Words create worlds, which sometimes must be torn down to build something new. As we begin our approach to the high holy days, may we each merit to choose our words carefully, to underpromise and overdeliver, and for the chance to start over. Shabbat Shalom.